Good evening. Welcome to this seminar hosted by the Center for Medical Ethics and Law at the University of Hong Kong. I am Eric Ip, co-director of the center, and it's my pleasure to chair today's session. Thank you to our in-person and online guests and attendees. Please silence your phones, and online participants, please keep your microphones muted unless invited to speak. Today, we explore AI's potential in disability and assistive technologies, its promise and its ethical challenges with our distinguished speaker, Professor Jackie Leach-Scully, who is Professor of Bioethics and Director of the Disability Innovation Institute at the University of New South Wales. Her research focuses on technology's ethical impacts for people with disabilities, and she holds key roles, including chair of the New South Wales Health Ethics Advisory Panel. Professor Scully will share insights from the Disability Innovation Institute on AI-supported technologies and proposed solutions. This one-hour seminar includes a presentation and a Q&A session. So please kindly join me in welcoming Professor Jackie Leach-Scully.
Okay, hello everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay. This is my first time in Hong Kong ever. I had a quick language lesson from the first person who arrived here, so I can say ni hao. That's it. Sorry. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. I am hoping to talk a little bit about AI and disability. It's not very much that's technical about AI in it, so if you have any questions about the computer language or anything, I can't help you with that. I'm a bioethicist by trade, and I have a particular interest in various kinds of medical innovation and the ethical issues that affect people with disability in particular. So I'm going to go very quickly through some comments about AI in healthcare. I'm not going to go into detail, but the reason I want to talk about healthcare is to contrast it with the case of disability, because the two are often put together in a way that I think is not helpful. I'm going to focus on algorithmic bias and then talk about AI and disability in general. And in the second half-ish of the talk, focus on a project that I've been involved with at my home university, University of New South Wales in Sydney. I'm bringing up a particular issue which does seem to be distinctive in disability context about recognition. And I'll talk more about that when we get there, and end with some ideas about how we might be able to use AI to promote inclusion and equity for disabled people. Please put your hand up if I'm talking too quickly, because I know I tend to speak very quickly when I get into the flow of things. So if you want me to slow down at any point or speak louder, then indicate to me. Together with other people in the institute that I run at UNSW, an institute called the Disability Innovation Institute. The majority of people there who work there have a disability of one kind or another. Mine is that I'm actually extremely deaf, so I don't know how loudly I'm speaking. So sometimes I don't speak loudly enough. You must indicate to me. And if there are questions at the end, I might have problems. So we'll see how we go. So just have a bit of patience, maybe. So I'm going to say a few things about AI in healthcare. In the project that I'm involved in, we talk generally about algorithmic systems as being the kind of devices or the structures or just the systems that use predetermined instructions, the algorithms, to analyze data, and they use any computational logic. Increasingly, AI is used in healthcare and health research, and in social care, and what you might call social management and social administration, how governments and organizations of different kinds sort of manage their populations in different ways. And there's a lot of expectation that AI will help to solve some of the emerging challenges in in healthcare, which are to do, in some ways, the challenges are to do with improvements in the science that generates a huge amount and volume and complexity of research data. There's an increased demand on healthcare services because people are living longer, which is in itself a good thing, but the longer you live, the more likely you are to require some kind of external support or help. And there are also, in many countries, Australia, I don't know if it's the case here too, chronic staff shortages in healthcare. And the hope is that AI will sort of help with that. So I'm sure you're all familiar with this kind of thing, but you'll see AI now in areas of diagnosis, for example, in radiography, particularly spotting things that are rare that an individual human might not have experience of, but the computer can. Analysis of loads of data to find particular patterns and correlations. That's very useful in sequence analysis. And then more practically, things like robotics, so using care robots or surveillance instruments of some kind, chatbots to engage with patients or to engage with customers, various kinds of apps for self-care or for monitoring of your health, like counting my steps when I went to the Star Ferry today and all the way back again as well, 12,000 steps. Different kinds of administrative tasks that take up a lot of clinicians' time. And then more speculative things like using AI in triage in case there's a situation of emergency. And because of this interest, there's been a whole load of different kinds of reports and publications and so on, a roadmap for artificial intelligence in healthcare in Australia. There are a number of very familiar ethical issues, which I won't go through in great detail. We can talk about them more afterwards if you want. There's the so-called black box effect, which is that the system that you're using that is AI-based is so complicated that no person using it actually knows what happens. You put the data in a healthcare situation, something magic happens, something comes out at the other side, and the clinician can't really explain to the patient what was happening in the magic bit. That can be quite problematic when you're talking about things like informed consent. How do you actually inform the patient about what's going on here? It can also have an impact on clinical skills with the doctors and nurses themselves not understanding what's actually happening and where the answer that they've got has come from. That leads to issues to do with the moral or legal responsibility if something goes wrong when AI is used. There's a lot of research going on in the legal field about that. In terms of data security and privacy, massive amounts of data are sort of circulating through different kinds of systems with different levels of security. And one of the particular things which I'll come on to later about disability is that these systems are multiple and they're interlocking. So it's not data that's contained within one university or one healthcare system, but they're interlocking through other bureaucratic algorithmic systems as well. And the more that happens, the harder it is to keep data secure. But you're familiar with, virtually every day there's something in the news about a data leakage or cyber attack or something like that. And then there's the impact that increasing use of AI in healthcare has on the patient and clinician interaction. So what happens when there's a conflict between what the AI says and what the clinician thinks. One of the projects that I'm involved with is to do with producing a device an AI-based device, which will assess the quality of a donor organ for transplant when it reaches the hospital where it's about to be put into the patient who needs it. And one of the questions we've been dealing with is what happens if the AI-based evaluation says, it looks at the kidney and says, yeah, this is fine, use it. And the clinician themselves is looking at it, maybe feeling it and saying, no, I'm not really sure about this. Who wins in that sort of case? there's a potential loss of clinician skills again, and also the problems of integrating a very new approach into existing systems and resistance sometimes from the clinicians themselves. However, one of the most recent and major ethical issues that has arisen within the use of AI in general, but particularly in healthcare, was that it was originally hoped, I think, that because it was a computer that was coming and doing it, it would be more neutral and more objective in the handling of data. And so for discriminated populations, if you like, it would reduce discrimination. There would be less exclusion. But it's become very clear over the last few years that AI systems are not neutral in the way that they handle data. The bias or non-neutrality can come in, first of all, in the database on which the system that you're using is being trained. So, for example, in many countries at least, there's a preponderance of healthcare data about the majority population, which in the UK, in Australia, Europe, is going to be white, middle class, relatively healthy population with what you might call popular conditions, i.e. not rare ones. They're statistically underrepresented. And they're also, crucially, mostly from the non-disabled population as well. And that biases the data that's being used to train the system. The algorithm itself can be biased in the way that it's handled because it is developed by human beings and can sometimes perpetuate existing discriminatory patterns. And then at the end, of course, there's a bias potentially in the way that that information is used by human beings and human systems, as we'll see shortly. As I said, I went through that largely to give a kind of background against which to contrast some of the issues that come up with disability. I want to emphasize that disability raises some of the same issues, but some different ones as well. And one of the frustrations, and I think the thing that we need to be cautious about, is very often it's assumed that disability is kind of the same thing as illness, and therefore it's, you know, it all comes within the same box. But disability does raise different issues. First of all, disability is a hugely diverse sort of category. It's also very large. It's estimated to affect about 1.3 billion people globally. In Hong Kong in 2020, it's supposed to be about 7% of the population have some kind of physical disability, with about 1% of the population having some kind of intellectual or cognitive disability. Estimates are very vague across the world because different countries identify and count disabilities differently. So there's wide variation in numbers. Disability doesn't necessarily compromise health. You can have a person who has quite a severe disability, but is actually very healthy. I have been deaf since I was a child, but I've not been ill because of being deaf. I think I'm a normally healthy sort of person for my age and height and weight and all those things. One of the reasons that disability is conflated with illness is because traditionally disability has been seen as a medical problem, and disability is identified as being if somebody's body or mind deviates from a sort of physiological norm and therefore is disabled. And that's considered to be what used to be called the medical model of disability. So it's very much a medical thing. It's identified by medics as medical solution. In the last 30, 40 or so years, a number of other ways of looking at disability have arisen, so-called social models or sometimes relational models, interactive models, different names, but they all come down to pretty much the same thing, which is that it's seen as being a more complex phenomenon that kind of emerges out of a mismatch between the way somebody's body or mind is and the way society responds to it or is able to accommodate that difference. So it's something to do with, and it's an interactive phenomenon, and that makes it much more complex than simply looking at it as a medical issue. Now, we know that globally, disabled people everywhere face particular barriers to do with exclusion from the everyday world. and difficulties of participation in social life, in the workforce, in education, and so on. All of those things have knock-on effects, creating other problems for them. So if you're excluded from the workforce, then you're likely to have a lower income and be poorer, and your health may be lower, and so on. And here, AI-based technologies are seen as providing, potentially a really transformative experience for people with disability in being able to provide very individualized supports that can help reduce some of those barriers of access, and so increase people's autonomy and their inclusion. And here are some examples of that potential involvement, particularly in assistive technologies, and that's the point I want to emphasize at the moment. So you could have, for example, a system using machine learning or pattern recognition that could provide very targeted and personalized assistance for individuals with very distinctive disabilities, providing cognitive support like memory aids, or not just for elder people or people with dementia, but perhaps for people with intellectual impairments as well. People with visual impairments can make use of text reading, sort of navigation aids, the generation of the descriptions, automatic generation of descriptions of images, so that whoever is putting the image up doesn't have to do that themselves. For people with communication disorders, you have things like speech to text or text to speech, captioning and transcription that we use, most of us use anyway, routinely now with Zoom and Teams and so on, which it's worth pointing out are not just supportive for people with disability, but also supportive for people working in their second or third or fourth language. It can be very helpful to see it written out. Different kinds of physical assistance, AI-powered prosthetics, and AI powering robotic exoskeletons and so on. Different kinds of smart systems for a device like a wheelchair with environmental awareness, a device that will sense the kind of floor that a person is walking on, and also get signals from their kind of muscles and where they are to give very rapid warning that they're about to fall, which can be helpful for them and for the people around them, and so on. And perhaps that they're really at the cutting edge of complexity. There are brain-computer interfaces or neuroprostheses, which are being developed hopefully for assisting mobility with people with mobility impairments, or if they can't handle objects very easily, then using a device that will handle the object for them, and even potentially for non-verbal communication. Now, all of that, I think, is enormously promising for leveling the playing field for people with disability. However, what I'm going to talk about a little bit further is the stuff that isn't about assistive technologies or about care. There are, because it is sometimes forgotten that these assistive technologies that are targeted and directed at people with disability to support inclusion, but people with disability are also using the other technologies that are not directly targeted at people with disability. And in many cases, those increase the barriers rather than reducing them. So for example, if you have a voice recognition technology, that can often not work for people with some kind of speech impediment, or cerebral palsy or something like that. If you have impaired motor control, then systems that work through a kind of manual interface may be problematic. I have a colleague I work with who is quadriplegic, and so she can't use her arms. When my university switched to multi-factor authentication for getting into your university system, she was effectively cut out because she can't move fast enough to put the number into her mobile phone, that kind of thing. And the system was not set up to make an exception for one person. It's extraordinary in 2024, which is when it was happening. Okay. The transitions to looking for support and assistance away from people and towards some kind of device. Also, at a more fundamental level, changes how responsibilities for care are distributed and how they are expected, and the kind of support that's provided and the kind of human interactions that people have. So we'll see a bit more about that later. On a more abstract level, the datafication, the turning into data of things like a diagnosis of a disability, assessment, and then providing the right kind of care or support, whether that's a device or financial support, can miss the immense heterogeneity of disability, which I mentioned earlier on. Its fluidity, the way that a disability can change over a lifetime. Even if it's not a progressive one, it can interact with age and with other impairments. It can change from day to day. It can change in terms of context. So how visually impaired you are can depend very much just on how bright the light is around you, or how noisy and obstructed your environment is. So disability is very, very particular. It's a very individualized experience. And there is a concern that computers that basically work, one and zero will fail to capture that kind of complexity. I mentioned earlier that AI ethics had been becoming concerned about algorithmic bias, but the case studies that it's looked at mostly have been to do with the systematic exclusion, perhaps by sex or gender, by race, and sometimes by economic class, but there's been very little about disability so far, which is important because increasingly algorithmic social profiling like that is being used for systems of evaluating and allocating supports in health and in social care. So I work in one of the projects I'm in is the Australian Research Council funded Centre of Excellence in Automated Decision Making and Society. So automated decision making is those decisions that are actually basically AI generated. On a banal level, they're things like the predictive text that you have on your phone. On a bigger level, it's deciding automatically how much financial support a person with disability will get, according to their disability. So we set up an empirical project that wanted to explore how ADM was affecting people with disability in Australia. So it's a qualitative rather than quantitative study. That means it's relatively small. We're trying to go down into the detail of the experiences of people with disability. Just as a kind of side issue, I've been a bioethicist now for longer than I want to remember, about 30 years, I think, something like that. And I consider myself an empirical bioethicist, so I go out and get empirical data. The thing that I have learned through those years is that if you talk to people who are actually using or experiencing the biotechnology, they will tell you things that have never appeared in the literature and that none of the professionals will ever tell you because they haven't experienced it. So that's why I do the empirical research. And that is what happened in this study. We started out just with key informants, interviews with people from disability policy who were implementing AI-based systems, and people in disability activism, some of whom were very much against the implementation of automated systems. And we also used a method called dialogue groups, which I'll talk about a little bit here. The dialogue groups were held with non-specialists. There were 4 groups who were of disabled people and 4 of non-disabled people. The method that I used was one I developed in the early 2000s because I wanted to find a way of getting ordinary people who didn't normally use ethical language like, autonomy or, that kind of language, and who are not used to talking about moral issues, to be able to articulate what they thought about a new technology, and particularly if they thought it was a problem, to be able to say what the moral basis of that was. So essentially, talk more about it later if you want, essentially, the participants in the groups are given the bare minimum of technical information that they need to engage in the discussion. And then they're given some fictional scenarios, which are designed to illustrate particular ethical issues. So with these dialogue groups, if I remember rightly, there was a scenario about using automated surveillance of a person with dementia in their home. There was a computerized assessment of somebody with intellectual disability for her financial support. There was a person with cerebral palsy who was doing an online interview for a job that involved voice recognition that was problematic for him. And there was a story about a disabled couple with a child where the health system became concerned about the child's care in the family. So what happens then is that people given the story, we work through the story, and the advantage of a fictional story is that you can change bits of it as you go along to kind of probe what people think. So somebody will say, I think this is wrong, more or less. And you can say, well, supposing the child wasn't 2 years old, but supposing the child was 18, 17, would it change things? And that helps you explore what people find are sort of morally fundamental and what is less important to them. So we had some general findings from this study, which were very much overlapping, I think, with the kind of things that one might find if you did this in the healthcare area. So they were familiar. They were things to do with data privacy, but the particular, if you like, the disability spin was that people were recognizing that if you are disabled, you tend to get tangled up in healthcare systems, but also social care systems, but also special educational systems. And because of that, there is this added problem of data kind of bleeding from one area to another in a way that you might not actually want to have happen. Issues to do with, consent and with monitoring. And so here's a quote from one of those groups: the speed at which information is put together, different data points put together from different agencies, it escalates and it scales harm pretty quickly. So they went straight into that point. There's a mistake in the next line. It should say autonomy versus dependency. There was the desire to make sure that these systems actually do support autonomy and independence and not make you more dependent in a roundabout way on that support. And that particularly comes out of a history of paternalism to do with disabled people, a history in which their own control over their lives has been taken away from them if they're placed in institutions or placed under guardianship and so on. There was this risk of becoming dependent on complex assistive devices. That is not something that you find in the literature very often, but it came up again and again and again. If people saying, okay, I have a mobility impairment, I have a stick, or I could have this wonderful AI-supported, environmentally sensitive thing. But what do I do when that goes wrong? Or what do I do when there's a power cut and I can't use it? Do I just use my stick? What if I can't use my stick anymore because I've forgotten how to use it? That kind of thing. They were very aware of the economic barriers in particular that prevent people with disability getting access to this, because they were conscious of that way in which disabled people everywhere in the world are on average poorer and on average less well educated for a number of reasons. So they also don't have the technical literacy to understand how to use these systems. There was, I have to say, a lot of skepticism about why these systems are being brought in. So people would say to us things like, they always tell us these systems are there to improve efficiency, to make things happen for us faster. But as they said, systems like this that try to automate things do it to increase profits. I see it very tied into capitalism. That was what one of them said. So they were clear that it was basically to benefit the producers of the system. And they talked about the need for human connection and about bias and discrimination. I want, though, to focus on the particular point that I think was distinctive of these groups and that I haven't seen in any other situation that's been talked about AI in healthcare. which is what I'm bringing to you tonight. And that was a complicated thing to do with recognition. Just going back a little bit, for those of you who have some sort of political science and so on, recognition is a concept that came in around the 1990s in a political sense to do with the importance of understanding individual people's claims about their identity or groups' claim about its identity, to be fair in allocating resources, and also to be fair in making good where there's been previous discrimination or harm. So that's part of, in a sense, the rise of identity politics and people talking about a disability identity and so on. It was tied to the concept of misrecognition, which is the harm when that doesn't happen, when a system or people, state or whatever, doesn't recognize a particular group or an individual as having that particular identity. So what was interesting to me is that these are fairly complicated ideas, sophisticated academic ideas. And these were people who pulled those ideas out of their own experience. So they identified 3 forms of recognition not happening or going wrong, which I'm going to talk about a bit more. The first was failure to recognize the diversity of disabled experience. I mentioned before the way AI relies on datafication. That means turning phenomena and experiences into something that a computer can read and understand. And they were very skeptical that their own experience of disability could be represented algorithmically. So they said things like the complete questionnaire. This was the questionnaire they were given to assess their level of disability. The complete questionnaire didn't fit at all. None of these questions fitted. I felt disregarded, said this quote. That these systems miss the diversity of impairment, and they will miss its relational and dynamic nature, and they miss the fact that it is embedded in a social context, and that makes a profound difference to how the same impairment is experienced very differently for 2 people in different contexts. They felt that the algorithmic management of disability ended up just kind of invisibilizing them. Because they didn't fit anywhere, they became invisible to the system. But you tell the algorithms how you feel, they just receive input. They don't see or feel the disability. The second kind of lack of recognition was not recognizing disabled people's knowledge. So when an assessment of health or social need happens, one of the things that is happening is the creation of some kind of knowledge. It's an epistemic practice in that sense. You're producing an understanding, a shared understanding across society about disability, about what disability is, and how one should respond to it. And the participants were describing how automated data categorization could not integrate knowledge that fell outside the predetermined category, and that this is very different from talking to a human being. If you talk to a human being and you say something they have never encountered before, they can deal with that. If you're talking to an AI system and it encounters something it's never encountered before, unless it is highly sophisticated and in development, bearing in mind that when systems are being implemented, they're not in development, it's not going to be able to cope with that. That was their fear anyway. So in the assessments, they said, if you don't fit exactly that category, you lose points in terms of how disabled you are. Algorithms do a great job within set parameters, but when it comes to assessment, you need a whole lot more understanding of disability to start with. And that's what you might call the epistemic injustice of disregarding a person's own knowledge about their body experience is something that has been universal, I think, or near universal for most disabled people. But the situation when you're faced with a fairly rigid system, an automated system, is different from what it was before. And perhaps the most complicated and most subtle point is a kind of ontological recognition. the participants felt that they needed to be recognized by another human. They needed to have their situation recognized by another human for the practical reason of correcting errors. So as one said, we need a background check, human element, because mistakes are made and things can be misjudged. But also in a much, almost, it's not a rational thing, really. But they wanted to feel, have that recognition that, okay, your situation is being acknowledged, and a computer sitting opposite you or wherever it is not going to give you that sense, which a human would. Now, I don't think this is unique to disability, but it doesn't come up very often in the kind of practical literature about problems with AI. One of the things that's sometimes suggested as a way of solving this sense of distance between humans and AI situations is ensuring that there's always what's called a human in the loop, that whatever the system is, that somewhere there's a human being overseeing things and so on. With the idea that that human will act as a corrective. So if things go wrong, they'll be able to steer them away from some catastrophe. Now, some of our participants were in favor of ensuring that there was always a human in the system somewhere. So they said, a human, because there are aspects of disability that a computer can't pick up on. And you feel more comfortable talking to a human than to a computer. But some had much more mixed responses because they had experienced discrimination in the human setting from human assessors. So as one thing, some assessors, humans, are very detached when they go through the process, asking you questions. They've got to go along with the system and, well, they're like robots, essentially, at the end of the day. So an actual robot wouldn't be much different. And some of them actually felt that they would do better with systems that were completely automated and that did not have any human in the loop. So I'm not going to conclude here that one or the other is better, just to say we maybe need to be cautious before concluding that human involvement in something like this is necessary and is always the kind of, that it will avoid all the problems, that it will solve all the problems. Because the suggestion I'm making is that to avoid that kind of stereotyping is going to involve other safeguards, not just putting a human being in as the corrective. And I think this one also, this point, probably is applicable to other situations of marginalized populations too, who will have experienced discrimination from human people and may paradoxically trust a machine more than they trust other people. So finally, just some thoughts. I have no sort of concrete recommendations, but how can AI actually promote inclusion and equity for disabled people and not make things worse? One of the key things is to understand the potential consequences of algorithmic bias and other kinds of harms, but that's going to require empirical knowledge and knowing that and being aware of the fact that you can't extrapolate from one kind of discriminated population or marginal population to another and assume that the problems are going to be the same. In each case, you're going to have to go in there in detail and actually find out. Needing to recognize that social understandings or sometimes misunderstandings and sometimes prejudices about disability are going to be included in the algorithms because the algorithms are devised by humans who have their own prejudices. And they will import those assumptions about normality, for example, into the black box, which is difficult because you're not going to be able to see what's going on in the black box. So there's a need to resist the pressure somehow to conform what you're saying about what your life is like to machine readable norms, which is what's probably going to happen. And because that might end up reducing the acceptance of diversity. There's going to be these shape categories to put yourself into. And if you can't put yourself into, you become invisible to the system and then to the rest of society. We need to recognize that the distinctive nature of disability is important if we're going to be designing equitable and just systems of AI and automated systems. And all of that comes down to the point that it's essential to include those people who are going to be affected, who are at the pointy end of these systems. in the designing of AI-supported systems and algorithmic automation and the human input, how to get the balance between the automation and the human in some kind of loop. That was a very fast talk through of some of the work that we have been doing. I hope it was comprehensible. There's some papers there, one of which is forthcoming, but the other two are already published with my colleagues, Georgia Van Toorn and Sandra Gendera, on that work that we have been doing. And this final image is of a film that Georgia Van Toorn and Jenny Lee produced about problems of AI and disabled people. It is not rejecting AI and ADM, but asking the question, where is the tech that we really need? Oh, thank you.